Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. I'd like to welcome back David Clement. He is no relation to the show. He is the policy director of the Consumer Choice Center. Welcome back to Boom and Bust.
Thank you for having me, Tony.
So, David, I guess just for the benefit of our audience, we're still in the middle of these trade talks with the U.S. Between the U.S. and Canada. As of the time of our conversation, we don't know all the details, but it appears that one of the topics has been what we call our supply management system for chicken and dairy and eggs. That's definitely in the news. There may or may not be changes to that situation. But what I'd like to do is at least is get a fairly deep dive into what that is and why you think it needs an overhaul.
Yeah. So what it is, supply management is essentially a very Trumpy, protectionist system that we have had in place since the 1970s. And it largely is twofold: quotas. So for in layman's terms, the license to produce, and tariffs on international goods in those sectors. And those tariffs range from 150 to as high as 300%. And so we've had this system in place since the 70s. And what that has meant is that Canadian production in those categories, chicken, turkey, eggs, milk, cheese, is just for the domestic market. And the Americans have complained about it under President Trump in his first administration. They complained about it under Joe Biden, and now Trump has also complained about it again. But it's really important to inform viewers that right now the debate is framed in an American context. But this is not a grievance that other countries don't share. In fact, it's something that the Australians, the Kiwis, the Brits, and probably, I would say, more than half of the European Union has complained about. In fact, it's the reason why our potential trade deal with the UK fell through, and it is largely the reason why the majority of EU member states have not ratified our trade agreement with Europe, because they do not appreciate not having access to the Canadian market.
So, why is this the current status quo on this? Why is that bad for consumers, in your point of view?
Yeah, so it's bad for consumers because it artificially inflates prices. So the research from prior to the pandemic was about 500 or so dollars a year for the average family. That number is likely far higher now because we had runaway inflation during the COVID years. Food inflation has been particularly sticky and outpacing the general rate of inflation pretty consistently since the beginning of the pandemic. So that number is far higher, and that might not sound like a lot to somebody watching, but in the perspective of low-income Canadians, the peer-reviewed research on this shows that it pushes between 120 or 180,000 Canadians under the poverty line. Because if you are struggling to make ends meet, an extra $500 can make the world of a
Mm.
difference. And the reason why it inflates prices is actually pretty simple. One, because of how supply management is made in terms of the compensation for dairy farmers that's guaranteed in what they call the cost of production formula. But the real root cause is that there is no competition. And so when you limit yourself just to domestic suppliers without any international competition, you have no downward pressure on prices at the grocery store, which is why we pay 20, 30, 40%, depending on the supply managed product, more than they do in the United States. And so that's really the kicker here in terms of how this impacts everyday Canadians, is that it just fundamentally inflates the cost of core food items that so many of us enjoy, to a point where Canadians are pushed under the poverty line. And I think that's a real shame that we still defend this program, while at the same time we've had record number of Canadians lining up at food banks. I have yet to find anyone who can reconcile that problem.
Interesting perspective. Well, I'd like to continue this particular discussion after the break, David. We're going to take a little break. We'll be back with our guest, David Clement, after these messages. I'd like to welcome back to the show David Clement. He is the Policy Director of Consumer Choice Center. David, we're talking about the supply management system for chicken, I guess other poultry, dairy and eggs and so on. So is there a way to open up the system while still helping Canadian farmers? I mean, a lot of them are afraid of going out of business, I guess, if the supply management system is blown up.
So the peer-reviewed research on this suggests that the domestic advantage of protectionism probably no longer holds because the demand for animal proteins, as we have an emerging global middle class, is only going up. And the best kind of case study of a system where they got rid of supply management would be New Zealand, who is now a major exporter
Mm,
to most of Asia. There's no reason why we wouldn't be able to join a global export market for these products. But for farmers who are worried or complain about competition, there is a strange, whether consciously or not, concession in that type of statement. And the implication is that they are so structurally inefficient
mm,
that there is no possible way that they could compete. And for me, that doesn't really hold up because we allow American access into the Canadian market for virtually every other agricultural product, right? Take a look at
right.
beef. American beef has not completely uh, killed our beef farmers and ranchers. I think it probably accounts for 10 to 15% of the Canadian market,
Mm,
puts a little bit of pressure price wise at the grocery store, and we're all better off because of that. Because of that, I don't see a scenario where our dairy farmers are just so structurally inefficient that it would be mass bankruptcy across the domestic sector.
What about the argument about food security? That the idea that Canadians growing and cultivating food products for Canadians is inherently better for Canada than to be at the mercy, of the United States or other countries when it comes to our food supply.
Well, I mean, the best way to ensure food security is to make the world our grocery store, not to insulate ourselves with a Trump style policy that means we essentially just produce for the domestic market.
Mhm.
And this is again one of the important things about supply management is yes, the president is complaining about it, and yes, most Canadians really dislike the president, and in many instances for very good reasons. Um, but repealing or phasing out supply management opens us up to the rest of the world. And so it's not just about American dairy, it's also about French cheese and British cheese or British chicken or you name it. And so I think the core here in terms of food security, and part of food security has to be affordability, is making the world our grocery store, which we do for so many other
Mhm.
agricultural products, except for the small handful of protected farmers.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I think that's important too, that I mean, this debate has gone on for decades, as you alluded to, and really was a domestic debate, but now it's got all wrapped up into Canada-US trade talks. And so, uh, people that are looking at it from the lens of not giving a concession to Trump or to the United States, right? So that complicates things, doesn't it?
So it does, but we will have to address the elephant in the room here at some point.
Mhm.
So right now we're in the pause phase. So hopefully a deal is struck and the trading relationship is solidified. So we may have to address this for the sake of the Americans and Donald Trump. Okay, that we may not like it, but we might have to do it. If there is no deal and there's a decoupling, and we want to seek trade opportunities around the world, well, we're going to have to address supply management because it's what the Europeans complain about. It's what the
Right.
Brits have complained about. It's what the Aussies and the Kiwis have complained about. And so if we want to go to any other major markets, we have to address this very protectionist system at some point or another. And yes, I understand there may be hesitation to the perception that we'd be giving Trump a win. But in many instances, we'd be giving Emmanuel Macron a win or the Prime Minister of England a win. And that's a really important
Mm.
distinction.
Fair enough. Fair enough. David, we're going to take another brief break. We'll be back with you after these messages. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. My guest is David Clement. He is the Policy Director of Consumer Choice Center. David, let's move on to a couple of other issues that the center is following. I noticed, I mean, we were speaking of government intervention with supply management, but I see the province of Quebec is now banning energy drinks for minors. Do you have a take on
Mhm.
this?
Yeah, it's a tragic case. What happened in Quebec was a young man was skiing, was on ADHD medication, which comes with a warning about caffeine consumption. Drank a energy drink and had uh, a heart arrhythmia and tragically passed away.
Mm,
And what that did is that sparked the Quebec government to ban them for minors, which I think for most people, there's not necessarily a strong objection to the concept of protecting minors, but the way in which the province did it is they didn't address the fact that the coroner's report said it was a complication between caffeine and ADHD medicine. They just specifically went after the one product. And the reason why that matters is your standard Red Bull has about 80 milligrams of caffeine in it. Your venti blonde roast from Starbucks has over 300 milligrams of caffeine. And so now with this ban, uh, what has happened or what will happen is um, so you will lose one for adults, you'll lose the convenience of anything that's not age gated. So that's vending machines, that's food delivery. So you can't get it via Instacart or Uber Eats or anything like that. So that has all been prohibited. It creates this weird disparity where you can no longer buy a Red Bull in those circumstances, but you could get a venti triple espresso caramel frappuccino that has 400 milligrams of caffeine and 400 milligrams of sugar, regardless of your age.
right.
And so the ban has just been applied really inconsistently in terms of what actually happened and the fact that this was a drug complication. And it ignored the fact that less than 15% of youth caffeine consumption actually comes from energy drinks themselves. Most of the caffeine that they consume comes from other sources. So I think it probably would have been far better to actually have a conversation and some education for parents. One, on drug complications, because that's
Right.
important, especially given the number of kids who are on those medicines. And two, what is the appropriate level of caffeine consumption for a young and developing mind? And I'm certain we could have had that conversation without banning a product class outright and doing it in such an inconsistent and silly way.
Yeah, so it comes down to a consistency, but also once government gets in the business of deciding which products are acceptable and which are unacceptable, you're going to have these complications. Is that part of the problem?
Yeah, and my concern is that it opens the door for future regulation because if you applied the logic behind the ban consistently, well, then you would be age gating coffee, right?
Hmm.
And so that means that when you get your double double at Tim's, you're having to provide ID because it becomes an age restricted good. And that might sound fantasy world right now. But the groups who have long pushed for these types of bans and prohibitions very, very quickly take their win and then move down the incremental list in terms of how they want this applied. And we've seen this time and time again. And so my concern here is that we're opening a door that's going to welcome, at least just on the basis of consistency, further regulation that's just incredibly irritating for adults. because there's one thing about protecting minors, but how are we impacting adults in that
Right.
protection of minors? And that's kind of the big red flag here.
Is your center also involved in the discussion about banning certain social media platforms when it comes to minors?
Yes. Yeah, generally speaking, these are um, mostly one, the responsibility of parents. Don't punt parenting to the state. I can understand the hesitations with youth access to social media, but don't punt that to the state. And two, it's very difficult to actually do this in a manner that's effective. And an example would be the French court just struck down their attempt at doing it
Mhm.
because it was unworkable from a privacy and free speech perspective.
Yeah, I guess in Australia's ban really is not much of a ban from what I've seen so far.
No, most of them have worked around it.
Yeah, exactly. David, we're going to come back for one final session. We'll be back after these messages. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, having a conversation with David Clement. He is the policy director of the Consumer Choice Center. David, another public policy area that the center is involved in involves drug policy reform in Canada. Why is reform necessary? First of all,
Well, it's necessary because Canadians wait an unreasonable amount of time for new and innovative drugs to enter the Canadian market. And so you can have treatments or potential cures that will be released in the United States that then take a year and a half plus, from getting approval from Health Canada to when it's actually in the provincial system for reimbursement. And so, what we've been talking about is an organization that most Canadians don't know exists. It's the Canada's Drug Agency. And what they do is provide a non binding recommendation to the provinces on whether or not a drug should be covered. But from a patient perspective, if Health Canada has already deemed a drug safe and effective, why are we waiting upwards of 300 to 500 days for a non binding decision before a drug can enter the market? And this is increasingly problematic for anybody with a rare illness because that can be, not to be hyperbolic, that can be a
yeah.
death sentence. That could be the difference between life and death. And we've seen this. There was a tragic case of a hockey player in Ontario who was seeking an experimental treatment, and the province of Ontario was waiting for their guidance from the CDA, which is non binding. They don't have to follow it anyway. Um, and he passed away while waiting
Wow.
for the guidance. And so just to go back to the real kicker here, Health Canada in many of these instances has already said safe and effective. And so why are we gumming up this process with a middleman that has no binding authority over the decisions of the provinces and limiting potential treatments and cures for people who are suffering?
So, what kind of reform are you looking for?
Well, one, I would probably drastically reform the CDA and get them out of the game in terms of these types of non-binding recommendations so that the provinces can move faster on making these decisions. Two, I'd probably go the route of New Zealand in terms of peer country reciprocation. And that
Right.
sounds complicated, but basically what the proposal is you create a list of peer countries, so countries with healthcare standards that meet our own. And if a drug is already approved in two of them, so let's say it's approved in Australia and the United States, well, then Health Canada will give it the green stamp and say, okay, you can enter the Canadian market because you've done your due diligence in regulatory environments that are similar to ours.
Mhm.
We're not going to make you redo all of the hoops, clinical trials, etc., um, just to enter the Canadian market. And so those would be the two big ones in terms of reform, because that would speed up the pace in which we have access to innovative medicines. But it would also put some downward pressure on overall pricing because a lot of the kind of cumulative cost buildup comes with these these regulatory hurdles that are in many instances redundant, not because they're not important, but because they've already been done, right? A company's already proven safe
Right,
and effective in Europe and the US. We are not fundamentally different than the Americans or the Europeans as human beings,
right.
and so naturally, I think it should just roll over.
So who would be against this? It seems like pretty common sense, and obviously the drug companies would like a streamlined system too to get their product to the right people. But why is there such
I
resistance
mean,
to this?
there's some bureaucratic pushback on the side of Health Canada, maybe seeing it as a means of regulating or deregulating themselves out of a job.
Mm,
But in a reciprocal nature, then Health Canada also becomes an option for approval in
mhm.
any of these other systems that have reciprocation. So it may actually be beneficial for Health Canada because they can set a global standard and have companies line up to get approved here so that they can enter other markets.
David, I'm afraid our time is up. It's always great having you on the program. Thanks for all of your insights today.
Thank you.
So that was great to have David Clement on again, Policy Director of the Consumer Choice Center. Lots of issues, including our supply management system and drug policy. I hope you enjoyed the show today.